James C. Hume's author of Confessions of a White House Ghostwriter. I understand from your book that you started off in life as a lisper and a stutterer.
Yeah, like Churchill, both. And, you know, I always say that Churchill was, didn't go to university, couldn't get in. He was a lisper, stutter. He fainted one of the first times he spoke in the House of Commons. And yet his words would save a nation. And his grandson gave me some notes that his grandfather had, and I wrote a book about that. It was never published, but it was called The Language of Leadership, Churchill's 5 Principles of Giving a Speech, which I say most people disregard. And actually, C-SPAN covered my talk when I gave a talk on that, his 5 principles. And so, yes, Churchill is a great hero for me. Met him when I was 18, which was, I was in school in England, and in between Hill School and Williams, and I went to this Parliamentary Association dinner. And by the way, this account is mentioned in Sir Martin Gilbert's biography of Churchill. And so I kind of really pushed my way into the receiving line. But he was in 1953, May 29th, and he was short, 5'6", and he had a very tiny, pink, soft hand. And I was introduced to him, and he said, "Young man, study history. Study history. In history lie all the secrets of statecraft." And I went back to my room that night and tore down the picture of Ted Williams and put up Winston Churchill. It was kind of metamorphosis of youth into manhood.
How did you overcome the lisp and the stutter?
Well, I did somewhat like what Churchill did. I tried to avoid for a long time words with TH. And the stutter, I tried to do the same thing. I tried to deliberately pause. And therefore, I was not as embarrassed when I was pausing involuntarily, if that makes sense. In other words, so I did that. And I did when I won the Mid-Atlantic debate. And really on MacArthur, that MacArthur should be dismissed. And this was kind of, and I took the other side of the debate and praised MacArthur, but I said, I revered the Constitution more than MacArthur, and I took that. That was my first real debating championship.
What year did you find yourself with no more lisp and no more stutter?
About 52. And I graduated. In 51, I had to really work on it in my debate, and I got over it. And I liked speaking very much. When I was a boy, I mean, I remember writing my first inaugural address. I was 12, and I think this is kind of neurotic and shows, but I was into history. And when most boys my age were playing Doris Day or Joe Stafford, I had these records of statesmen and also, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, and Sandburg, but I had the voice of William Jennings Bryan, "Do not press down upon the brow of labor," or Teddy Roosevelt, I had his voice, "The difference between me and Mr. Wilson is fundamental. He says he's a progressive, but he's not." I mean, any clipped voice, and I had these voices, Roosevelt, Churchill, and I was into that. And so I wrote my own inaugural address, and I had these kind of semper marches I would play to rev myself up, and then I would go off and I would give this talk, and it was crazy. But you remember the old New Yorker cartoons where they have dreams of glory, and the little boy would be up there, and I was just a little boy, but I loved history and the English language, and this is what, that's why Churchill was a great influence for me. I got decorated by the Queen some 3 years ago, and the citation read, "The only man on either side of the Atlantic who's written biographies, the only person, on the 2 greatest Englishmen, Winston Churchill and William Shakespeare." So I loved language and history.
What kind of decoration did you get?
Oh, it was just an OBE, it was, but...
What's that mean?
Order of the British Empire. And actually, these are couplings I got at the same time. But it was, that year was an important year for me. I met Churchill and danced with the Queen, and because of that I came down with a incurable disease called Anglophilia, and I confess to that.
What year was that you danced with the Queen?
It was Boxing Day, December 26th, 1952. I remember it very well, and I remember the song that was playing.
Was she Queen already, or?
Oh yes, she was Queen. She became in January, in February '52. The coronation was not till June '53, and this was a private kind of party. It was the birthday party, 16th birthday party of Princess Alexandra, who was probably the prettiest of the royals, and the Queen was still in her radiance. She was only 26. I was 18, and I was very scared. I was not, you know, I said I was at that age what you call suave. I mean, I would say, I want half a Dematassi, or, you know, what's the soup du jour? I mean, I was not suave and sophisticated. When this equerry says, it's appropriate for you to dance with Her Majesty. I mean, I was, and I don't know whether I can tell this now, but the Queen, the thing you noticed about the Queen was she's short, like 5 feet 1.5, and I was 6'2", and secondly, she has that wonderful English complexion, which is the upside of their downside wet climate. And the third thing is, and you have to understand, I was talking from the vantage of a teenager. She would make Dolly Parton run to the tape measure, and she had this kind of low-cut gown. Well, I mean, I was looking like this. I didn't want to look down. I afraid, you know, I mean, it was like looking at cleavage in the Virgin Mary or something, and I just stared, and she said, how do you find an English Christmas? Fine. Do you miss your family? Yes. I mean, and I was just afraid if I looked down, I'd go to the tower, and that's all I remember. But it was a great, you know, it was a singular experience, and I went back to the country. But I've always had a love of history and the English language.
You talk in your book about speech making, speech writing, and something called negative name dropping.
Oh yeah, why, that was a fun thing. You know, in the White House, people always try to demonstrate their power. I mean, Robert Redford could walk against some purple-headed guy who was, you know, special assistant national security for Clinton, and Robert Redford would be ignored for this one with power. This is the aphrodisiac of power. So I took this from the starlets who would go on to the show, maybe Johnny Carson or Leno, and they would say, you know, I had Julia Childs over for dinner and I burnt the roast. Well, the real thing is she had Julia Childs for dinner. So what you do for these people is you say, wow, Henry Kissinger really bawled me out for my memorandum. Well, the fact is, you were getting a memorandum to Kissinger. So it's what I call, and I made this as kind of a funny kind of thing. I had a book called How to Get Invited to the White House some years ago. But I remember what Alice Roosevelt Longworth told me, and this was, she said, James, in Washington is power, and then the illusion of power, and finally the access to the illusion of power. And she was pretty right. And so a lot of people operate on that illusion of access to power, Brian.
What do you do now for a living?
Boy, I do a lot of different things. I teach at University of Pennsylvania, the School of Government, and they also get law students and people from Wharton there. I also am a guest professor in Colorado. A chair was set up in my honor out there. I write speeches sometimes for corporate people. I deliver a lot of speeches for fee, and I write books. I've had, this is my 24th book, and I have a book coming out in November. So I do all of those things. If I'd stayed in law, I'd have made more money, but I've had more fun this way. And I say this as Confessions of a White House Ghost. The first confession is, Brian, that speechwriters are not as important as they would have people believe. I mean, I think the man on the street thinks he's some guru who puts ideas into the mind of the great man. And indeed, Roosevelt called his speechwriters, he was first to have a real team of them, the brain trusters. But I really think they're more like beauticians than brain trusters. Presidents do not necessarily like new ideas. because they can rattle the cages or rock the boats. But they're like old cliches reminted to sound like brilliant insights. Franklin Roosevelt could have said, don't push the panic button. But Sam Roseman, his speechwriter, wrote, let me again assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. John Kennedy could have said, be patriotic, but Sorensen wrote for him, ask not what the country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So again, you are the beautician to make someone not sound well. If the beautician makes your wife look well, the speechwriter often makes the president sound well. On
the ask not quote, there's a footnote in your book on page 2 where you say that Warren Harding said in 1923, quote, we need to be thinking not so much of what the country can do for us or what we can do for our country.
Yes.
And then you say, or more likely, the quote came from Philip St. John, headmaster at Choate in 1930s,
Yes.
who used to say frequently, it's not what Choate does for you, but what you can do for Choate.
Yes. When I asked Ted Sorensen, he said he was not, of course, aware of the Harding quote, though he did read other presidents. And Sorensen told me the only line that Kennedy really changed in that inaugural was enemy to adversary. But who knows? It's a great line, and it employs one of Sorensen's brilliant techniques of the parallelism. And there's only about 5 ways to make a very quotable zinger quote, and you can put them into a acronym: cream, contrast, rhyme, echo, which is this, alliteration, and metaphor. And this was the echo, where Lincoln had the echo in government of the people, by the people, for the people. Kennedy used it, in this, another time in the speech, that let us not fear to negotiate, but let us not negotiate out of fear. Again, the echo technique, which is often used by speechwriters.
When you go to speak to a group, let's say you want a standing ovation. You, James Humes, want a standing ovation. Can you get it?
Usually. And one thing I do is end with what I call soul shakers, and I've collected a lot of these soul shakers. Churchill said, begin strongly, and one theme, simple language, picture language, metaphors and images, and always end with the heart. And he said, pride, hope, love of family, love of God. And so I always try to end with one of those things. You mentioned that you may have seen my Lincoln speech, and I end with this line that Lincoln had etched into his heart, this one line, which was he had borrowed a book again and again, and then, of course, the book was destroyed by water. He'd read it. But the only one page left when he went back to pay the farmer was this one line, which was, it was a page with a woodcut of General Washington praying at Valley Forge, and underneath was the line that these men shall not have died in vain. And 40 years later, he would put that into the Gettysburg Address. Well, this is a kind of what I call a moving thing with which to end your speech, and so I often do that, yes.
You write in the book, I have written speeches from more presidents than anyone.
Yes, but that's misleading. I mean, I wrote a speech, for Eisenhower. It was in the end of 1960. And let me say, Eisenhower was not what people think he is. When you worked for him, you were private. He was a 5-star general. He knew the difference. I was scared of him. But I was brought in by a person I taught Sunday school for in Williams College, a Congregational church minister by Fred Fox was his name. And it was at the end of 60, and Nixon had been defeated. And so I did one of these, what we call Rose Garden rubbish for him. And then I wrote another speech in 67 when he was contemplating endorsing Nixon. Yes, I was probably closest to Nixon. I wrote for Ford and helped him with his autobiography. I did some contract speeches for Reagan, one which made kind of Guinness Book of Records. it was a real blooper, and I might say I have great respect for Reagan, who's probably one of the greatest communicators since Roosevelt. But in this speech, I was a translator. That is, one of your jobs as a speechwriter is to translate the bureaucratic into the poetic, the legalese into the eloquent, the complex into the simple, the corporatese into the conversational. And someone, Georgetown Foreign Service School, one of those schools, had written a speech. And Reagan had not yet announced for president. He had finished being governor. So he wanted to refurbish his foreign policy credentials. And so in the speech was Third World, at least 7 times. And Reagan, each time you get it, well, we must address the problems of Third World War. Or well, we need now to be concerned with Third World. And each time, instead of Third World War came out. And that was the last time, by the way, I ever told anyone or implied that I had helped write the speech, because I was there with Dick Schweiker and Walter Annenberg. And did you have something to do with the speech? And I was doing one of those things, well, one of these shrugs, no, that mean yes. And after that, I made it a rule never to go to a speech where my speech is being delivered, because I don't want anyone to say that Humes wrote the speech. I don't want anyone to come back to the speaker and say that. So I tell them beforehand, I'm not in the audience. I won't be there, and I deliberately do that.
Where were you born?
Williamsport, Pennsylvania, on Halloween, 1934. And I was not due for about a month. My mother and father went to a masquerade party. She was dressed as Aunt Jemima, which would not be politically correct today, and he was dressed as an Indian chief. And the host was a doctor who's dressed as a Cheshire cat, and he was going to be the obstetrician. And mother said, doctor, there's a hurry call here. And so Dr. Cat drove my mother to the hospital, still as Aunt Jemima, and my father pursuing as an Indian chief, and I was born on the elevator at 11:45, Halloween, 1934, and that may explain some of my eccentricities.
Your father died at age 43.
42. He died. Yes, he died. That is right, and it was a shock for me. My father was a loved man. I remember going on the Larry King show on radio, and someone called me and said, "Are you any relation to Sam Humes?" And I said, "Yes, I'm his son." He said, "Well, I still have his picture." And this was from Arizona, the finest man I ever met. And I constantly had people saying that. And my mother was very shrewd about this, because he said, "Look, I wouldn't have married Jesus Christ. Your father was a fun man." And she would even tell me kind of off-color stories my father told me, because she didn't want me to try to live up to an impossibility. And so she was wise on that. But no question, my father was a politician, and it impelled me in that direction. One of the first experiences I remember, we went down to Washington, and my father had been for Wilkie, but he had a mutual friend. And if you can believe, Brian, you could stop right in front of the White House in those days, walk in without a pass, without an appointment, and wait. And must have waited 2.5 hours, where my mother had 3 boys in the car. It was a Lincoln Zephyr, and she was furious that my father was fraternizing with, she thought, the enemy. And my father finally came out sheepish and said, "Eleanor, knew I shouldn't have talked to him. I knew I shouldn't have talked to him. The son of a bitch charmed me." Which I think was, but I remember then getting a little book of all the presidents from the White House. And my father did nurture me in history. I tell one story there. When I was, and I gave this talk at the representing Reagan 4th of July in 1988. And I said, my first 4th of July memory, my father took me to call on a woman who had had a 100th birthday a week ago. And her name was Mrs. Knight. Anna Gregory Knight. And she was there in this rocking chair, living at the home of her daughter. And he said, James, Mrs. Knight's father fought in the Revolution, and I want you to shake hands with her. And I did. And then she repeated this litany. She must have repeated, yes, Grandpappy went down the lane, and Pappy wanted to go too, and so you can be a drummer boy. And of course, her father at 67 conceived her, and so she was the last person who was a child of a revolutionary fighter. But I told the people there, we say that we have the oldest continuing democracy. But think of this. I shook hands with someone who fought to forge that democracy. And I think we really have a short history. And yet, I enjoy reading it, and I think of that experience. So my father deliberately must have thought that someday I could use that.
You say that your mother committed suicide?
Yes.
When?
1955.
And what were the circumstances?
I think a bad marriage, very bad marriage. She had a good first marriage, and her husband, and my stepfather, was maybe more weak. I said the two greatest influences on my life were my father and my stepfather. And my stepfather was the kind who always would promise and never deliver. He was always writing this great book, but he never did it. And I haven't written any, great bestsellers or any important books, important to me, but I wanted to finish them because I wanted to say I didn't want to be like my stepfather, who always promised. He was always, writing this play, and he'd meet people at a cocktail party, and he would snow them by, on this play I'm writing, or this, and that stuck to me. That he was I went through, 4 wives, wife after my mother, so he married within 2 months after my mother's death, so I was without a home to go home to, and it made me far more interested in family than I would have been, because I had no grandparents or parents, and much more interested in history.
Where do you live?
Philadelphia.
How many children do you have? 2. You tell a story about how your daughter became the editor of the Hartford Crimson.
Yeah.
How did she do it?
Well, she called me up and said, Daddy, if they're having the turkey shoot there, and the turkey shoot, they ask you about your politics, and it's kind of a rough house, good-natured thing, but the questions are serious. And they're going to ask my politics, and if I say Republican or conservative, I'm dead in this group, Daddy.
What year was this, by the way?
Like 1983 or something, 83 or something like that. And, well, I said, tell the truth, but do what you think, within those limits, do what you think you have to do. And she said, well, Daddy, I got it. What did you say? Well, she said, the first guy got up, and he said, I'm from Brookline, and so-and-so, so-and-so, and I'm a Leninist. Cheers. The next person gets up and says, I'm from Ridgewood, New Jersey, and I'm a Castroite. Cheers. And my daughter gets up, who's self-effacing like her mother, and very quietly said, my name is Mary Stewart Humes, and I'm a monarchist. Well, she said, Daddy, maybe some people thought it said Maoist or Marxist or anarchist, but at any rate, I got all the votes, and they think it's a big joke, little squib in the Crimson the next day. First monarchist elected the Crimson. Joking, she said, well, Daddy, I'm your daughter, and I'm as much of an Anglophile as you, so that's how she got it.
Where is she today?
She is with Mackenzie and a company. She's actually just flying to Budapest today to open up a branch there. She went to Harvard, and then she went to Oxford, got a first in classics, greats, and then to Yale Law School. And then she went with Davis Polk for a while, and now she's with Mackenzie as house counsel.
What about your other daughter?
Other daughter is, I think, much like me. She left Wellesley, which her mother went to, and went to Teach America, and she taught in a ghetto in Los Angeles for 2 years, and then is now teaching in a private school in Los Angeles, the Bishop School in La Jolla. But she's leaving that, and she's going to write for children's television. So they were my 2 daughters. My daughters, I think, when they were little, were not so much impressed with you know, working for a president. I remember working for Ford, and I was missing some kind of anniversary or birthday, so I had Ford call them. But they were interested in little, when they were little, that I'd hugged the original Winnie the Pooh, and they were very impressed by that.
Now, let's pretend that, little speech lesson here, you're going to give a speech, and you've got lots of little things that you do in a speech that you recommend. For instance, the first thing I notice is you say you write an introduction and give it to the people to read about you rather than letting them read the bio. Why?
Because so many introductions are so bad. They're reading the resume, and it's just boring. And he has 2 children. He's served on this committee, won this award. And so years ago, what I did is I wrote an introduction for someone and didn't say it, and he used it. So after that, I would photostat his introduction. This is the way John Jones introduced me there, if it's helpful. And I usually find, because I write it in such a way that makes them look clever, and it's short. And yes, I like to have an introduction that's short, and that the audience thinks they're interested in me as a personality.
Let me read the first paragraph. As you can see, and you wrote this.
Yes.
As you can see, James Humes is a large man.
Right.
And the scope of achievements and accomplishments is just as large. He is or has been a lawyer, legislator, diplomat, author, historian, actor, professor, and White House speechwriter.
Right.
But whether he was arguing in court, debating in the Pennsylvania Assembly, lecturing in the University of Pennsylvania classroom, authoring 20 books, acting on stage and television, serving as Woodrow Wilson Fellow at the Center for International Scholars at the Smithsonian, or drafting a presidential inaugural address, 2 passions dominated: a love of history and a love for the English language. Then, there's a little bit more here. But then, as you are introduced, what do you do at the very beginning that you don't like that other people do?
Other people begin with opening amenities. You know, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be here. And the typical speech, you know, he starts, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. And then that reminds me of a story, and they tell some stupid joke that they got from the 19th hole. And then they pull out a trade association article and read it. If you heard, you know, my Lincoln speech, I started out with a long pause before I speak, so the audience may think that I have a speech problem. And then I said, Gettysburg stinks. Now, it is a strong beginning. Churchill began his speech, and I delivered it for Bush 50th anniversary in the White House of Churchill's speech in May 8th, 1940. I speak to you for the first time since I became Prime Minister. And I will say to you what I told the new cabinet last night. The only thing I have to offer you is blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Now, that is not an opening amenity. Churchill believed you could do what he called parenthetical praise, that later on you could say, and by the way, I've spoken to many audiences, this one is the most responsive, and it's believed more. Because when you say something beginning where they expect it, people discount it. So begin strongly, and this is Churchill's point, don't start with these opening amenities, because your prime time is the moment you speak. Everyone is listening. That's the greatest listenership. And you can dissipate that edge with, great to be here, and I've always respected the National Funerals Directors Association for the work they do. Well, one thing is that they expect you to say that, so you don't get any points. So begin strongly and capture their attention right in the beginning.
You see that Ronald Reagan used to drink warm water and eat a cookie?
Yes.
Why?
And you see him when he said, well, an old preacher and singer told me that. It was Billy Graham and Frank Sinatra. And he said that as you grow older, of course, your cords grow drier, and he needed hot water instead of cold water. And then he used the chocolate chip cookie for energy.
And did he eat a lunch or a dinner?
No, no lunch. And he would have that, and then you would see him just before putting on 2 eyes. I mean, he put 2 contacts, one nearsighted to see the notes, and one farsighted to see the audience.
Now, what do you do? Do you eat?
Very little. And of course, you don't drink milk or bread or teas. I drink, and I certainly never drink. And I enjoy a good martini afterwards because I'm up like this, but beforehand because I compare it to a pitching performance. I never use notes in front of me. In fact, I don't like a lectern. And it's the concentration required of a pitcher because I write the speech out and then totally commit it to memory. Now, every time I give a speech, I gave a commencement speech at University of Southern Colorado the other week. And when I finished, I knew of two things that I forgot to say. However, I felt I made up for that by the rapport with the audience, with no lectern, with no notes, so I'm looking at them all the time.
How long do you speak?
Well, it depends. I usually can keep the audience entertained because I'm a storyteller. When I go out as a paid speaker, they don't want me to speak less than an hour, believe it or not. And one time I spoke less and they complained. But of course, what I do is I go into a lot of characters, whether it's a Churchill or Roosevelt, and use their voices, so it makes time go more quickly when you do that. It's the same voice all the time. And people would often say to me about Reagan that Reagan was a great speaker because he was an actor. I wrote speeches for George Murphy and Shirley Temple Black. They weren't great speakers. The only actors I know to be great speakers are Shakespeareans because they're used to the long passages in Mark Antony or Coriolanus or Henry V. Reagan became a great speaker by being a speaker. He must have given the time for choosing talk hundreds of times in front of the General Electric audiences where he was speaking maybe 4 times a day, 4 times a week. Martin Luther King gave his address at least maybe 400 times, 500 times to NAACP groups, church groups, and you hone it. You hone the speech, and you learn the 2 great techniques of a speaker, and that is change of modulation and pause. And you know that in your own life. When you tell a story of how you met your wife or some stupid thing you did in college, you've told it so many times it's on automatic pilot, and you know just when to say, and you'll never believe, or the pause. And you learn that by giving one speech many, many times. And so when I teach my class, I always have them I said, I want you to give a speech you give the rest of your life. Because that's how you become a great speaker. Because when you give the speech over and over again, you learn the techniques of speaking.
Let me add, and some of this you may not want to answer, but if you wanted to, how many days a year could you speak in this country for money?
Oh, I don't know. I've spoken as much as 52 times.
A year?
Yeah, your time goes off in the summer, as you probably know, and that's a week time. But during, I can speak. I make more money out of speaking than anything else.
And what kind of money is out there? You may not want to give your own fee, but if you do find...
I'm not big money because I'm not a celebrity. Most people will pay a huge amount as a conduit to a famous person. And I'm not a household word. I'm lucky to have this book because I'm not a household word. And usually it's not the agents who bring the speeches to me, it's word of mouth. Because I've tried to sell it to corporations, and they will say, well, who is James Humes, and send a speech and send a tape, and I'm never really picked. But someone who's heard me picks me. They've heard me, maybe heard me on C-SPAN a couple of times, or they heard me and they said they find out and they want me to speak. But it's the problem in speaking is if this vice president in charge of public relations gets Humes to speak and Humes does badly, it's his fault. If he gets Brian Lamb to speak, and everyone knows of Brian Lamb, and you for some reason do badly, that's Brian Lamb's fault, not his fault, in a sense.
How much money is out there?
Well, the money for speaking is for celebrities, and I'm not one. I mean,
but I mean that second level, and what is the level that the non?
I'm at the very low. I get 4,000 or 5,000. I'm going out to Scotland this summer, and the other 2 speakers are Margaret Thatcher and Bob Dole. I'm speaking to the American Society of Travel Agents, and I'm getting $10,000.
Is there a lot of it out there, though? I mean, we read all those stories about
yes, because
former presidents.
All these programs doing that, and but I never deceived myself that they are coming to hear James Humes. They are coming because of Rotarians or Republicans or a member of this association. And because they come together to meet, there has to be a program. Because there's a program, there has to be a speaker. And so they get, and so I always start that I have to make them interested in me, because really that's not the point, that they're coming there to that dinner. And a lot of speakers really think that they're coming to hear them. I never believe that. There is a lot of money out there, and I have to say a lot of very bad speakers, very bad, where they take an article out and read the article. An article read aloud is not a speech. A speech has to be something it's an oral presentation that comes from your ideas and hopes, and it is not a article. A speech cannot be an article read aloud, and too many people are doing just that.
Where do you live today?
Philadelphia, and I said that. I'm a Pennsylvanian by background, and I go, my wife has a job, fortunately, and has been a tremendous source of stability for me, because I haven't had a job, and if I had stayed in law, I'd have made more money. But I go into a club every day, put on a suit and tie, go in there in a bare room, because writing is the most difficult discipline. If I stay in my house, I won't get up, I'll have a cup of coffee, and I'll do other things, and so I make myself put in so much writing a day.
Do you write in that vest? And
No, but I do not. But I read, but since I go in, I'm in coat and tie, and I write on a legal page. I don't use a word processor. I write on the way Nixon did, on a yellow legal pad. I was out there in California this other week giving a Lincoln talk, and my daughter was with me, and beforehand we were told that there was a new exhibit of Nixon's there, and they reproduced the study from Saddle River. Now, most of these museums have a replica of the Oval Office.
You study in New Jersey?
Yes, and they reproduced the study, and so we go in, and there's his legal tablet, and there's his pencil, and there's his engagement book. And there are a few books behind the desk, and my daughter says, "Daddy, that's your book right there." And it was my Churchill, biography of Churchill, and I wasn't supposed to walk, but I walked over, and there was my inscription to Nixon in 1980. But it was, and that was a very moving thing, that he had that with him, and, on the day he died. Nixon was, he was a person who was sometimes awkward in social situations, but he was the warmest in a intellectual situation. He was the warmest of all of them. He was an introvert or an intellectual in an extrovert's profession. So while you would see him at a cocktail party, and the Redskins, they're really gonna kick butts. I mean, but he was being one of the boys, and he wasn't quite. But in a working situation like this, he was very the most attentive to your needs. Well, Diane and the girls like to go to Camp David. I know you're working on Saturday. And yet he was intellectually exhausting. But he would say things like, the difference between Mao and de Gaulle, they were both mystics. One Catholic, one communist. Then he would explain that, or he'd say, now let's look at China in the year 2020. This is after he left office. But he was always, he would challenge anything when you wrote for him. And I remember one speech I wrote was 8 drafts, and what came out was 90% Nixon. But Nixon was a brilliant, the most brilliant person probably I've ever met, and he was intellectually exhausting. The difference between Ford, Nixon, and Reagan, Nixon edited your speeches heavily for substance. Ford didn't touch them, and Reagan edited them for style. Interesting.
You tell a story about when Bob Haldeman accused you of being on an ego trip.
Yeah, well, this was, a funny sort of thing. We did this thing for we landed on the moon, and it was a plaque on the moon, and that's what's taken here. Men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon in July '69 AD. But we had a couple martinis, and I wrote this other thing. I did it as a joke. Just as man explores space, hope unites mankind, exalting science. Well, this was an acronym for James Humes, and someone pointed out, and of course, you know, he said, well, you know, you've taken ego trip. I said, mea culpa. If you're trying to go to the moon, that's an ego trip, Bob. But you know, Bob was didn't have much of a sense of humor, and I'm not saying that to knock a person who's now dead. He was a Christian Scientist. And Nixon really wasn't that close to him. Nixon would use him because Nixon didn't like really interchange with people except people that he knew and on an intellectual thing. But he hated the kind of social meetings where people come in and talk about civil rights or need for it, because he already knew. He already knew what a person from the NAACP would say, in a sense. He already knew what they were going to ask for, and he already knew. So he didn't really like those kind of things because he already knew, and he didn't like to waste his time. But Haldeman acted as his traffic control. He really had he was not politically that conservative. He was a total pragmatist. But he was like a huge computer that, you know, this bill's up there and the so-and-sos talk about it, and he could repeat this to Nixon.
You have an acknowledgments section. I've never seen anything like this.
I know. When I got my OBE, and I used, all my friends were there, and I used all my friends who were there, and I used lines from Shakespeare to describe each one of them. And so I did the same thing for this. I'm a Shakespeare nut, and I do a one-man Shakespeare show, and it gave me a chance, I suppose, to show off my love of Shakespeare.
And here you see the underlying names there are the ones that you're acknowledging. For instance, David Eisenhower, Tom Evans, who used to be a lawyer for Richard Nixon. I see other names on there. And you quoted from Shakespeare to describe each one of them.
Yeah, and I do it in front of each chapter.
And in David Eisenhower's case, who is thy grandfather? He made those clothes, which it seems make thee.
Yeah, right.
How did you, did you just pick all that out from memory? Or?
Yeah, really. I just knew something of Shakespeare. I've read all Shakespeare, written a biography of him, and I just kind of picked this out. Picked things that, I had something, I had to look it up to make sure, but I remembered some of these things.
And some of those people on this list that you, Ambassador Faith Whittlesley, I'm looking for names that we might recognize, James Richley.
James Reichley, yeah, tremendous
Who was
scholar.
he?
James Reichley has written books. Was Brookings kind of conservative over there for years, and now he teaches at Georgetown. He was a writer. He wrote a book called Two Conservatives of Nixon and Ford. He also is, I think, the premier historian of the religious right, and he's written books about that.
Here's one, John Laboutier. We haven't heard that name for a long time.
Well,
former
he's a very
congressman.
close friend. Yeah,
he's a close friend.
Yeah, he's a close friend.
As true a dog as ever fought at head.
Well, he and I love dogs, so that's sort of a thing. He and I both love dogs, and he would enjoy that.
Jean Humes, who's that?
Well, it was the widow of John Humes, who was my cousin, who was ambassador to Austria, and so I talked about her and her devotion to her husband in that quotation.
And then someone else that seems to, he also wrote a foreword, Jonathan Aiken.
Yes.
The courtiers, soldiers, eye, tongue,
yeah.
sword, the expectancy, and the
right.
rose of the fair state.
Well, he's a very handsome, brilliant. He was the first at Cambridge. He has money. He has looks. He has, and it's too bad that's all he has. So he's very, and I think he just lost his seat, and as three of my friends did, cabinet ministers, all lost their seats in this overwhelming landslide. But he wrote the biography of Nixon, and Nixon asked that he talk to me, and that's the first time I met him, was at the opening of the Nixon Museum, and I took him to a guest, and there was Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Bob Finch and Herb Klein, and I said in introducing him, I said, Jonathan Aiken here, who's working on a biography of President Nixon, his uncle was Lord Beaverbrook. And Lord Beaverbrook was described by Churchill. He's my foul-weather friend. And so I said, everyone in this room is really a foul-weather friend of Richard Nixon. I used that because using it from Churchill's line, which I thought was good, to call people a foul weather friend.
And then there's another story about a relative of Lord Beaverbrook that you tell in here.
Yes. Well, she was Lady Jean Campbell, who was kind of a... she was the granddaughter of Beaverbrook, and I was going out in 1964 convention.
San Francisco.
Yeah, and I was for Scranton, and I was a legislator in the legislature, and Scranton was the governor, and we really had no chance. We knew it. And on the, I see Jacob Javits, and next to it, in English voice, and my wife always tells me, you know, it's not legs that I look at, but I hear an English accent, and I'm there. And so I start talking. We established friends, and she said, oh, my, she had this... her grandfather given this job. She's no journalist, and what should she do? Well, in Los Angeles, the plane was stopped for a bomb scare, and then before it went. So I said, here is your opening line, my knickers riffled for bomb. Knickers what they use for panties. So I wrote the headline for her, and she loved that. And then we went there, and I said, well, Scranton, Lodge was giving an interview on endorsing Scranton, and well, Lodge was immediately taken by her. And so we get to talk, and after I take her lunch at Ernie's. Now, I do not know that she's married.
In San Francisco.
Yeah, and we just go for lunch. And we just ordered our first course, I mean, shrimp we had there, and suddenly says, it's my husband, he'll kill you, he'll kill you. And it was Norman Mailer. And I didn't know that she was Norman Mailer's husband. He'll kill you. So we went out through the kitchen, out the back door, and I never paid the check for the shrimp. I mean, that was Norman Mailer, and I think he did, and actually stabbed someone in jealousy a couple years earlier. But that was Lady Jean Campbell, and she's was quite a character. Is quite a character. I guess. I mean, I think she's now in an Anglican convent. But there were rumors of her, strong rumors, that she's the only person in the world who knew biblically in 1 year Khrushchev, Kennedy, and Castro.
You tell a story on page 35 about Harry Truman, and you learned it from David Susskind.
Yes.
Has this ever been printed before?
No. And my only source for it is David Susskind. I was doing my Churchill show where I played Churchill for him, and he told about going to Kansas City. Truman had just left the presidency, and he really invented the kind of 30-minute or hour biography in which you do 10 hours and then cut it down to make it one. I mean, he really invented that genre of television. So he would go out every day, and he'd get to and it was pretty cold in March 1953 in Independence, and each day Mrs. Truman would meet him and said, just wait out, and he's waiting on the porch. So on the fourth day, it's Thursday, he comes down and he says, well, Mr. President, why am I not ever invited in? And he said, well, David, you're Jewish. And he said, I can't believe that. I mean, after all, I mean, you who supported the recognition of Israel, you were known for being for civil rights. I can't believe you just said that. He said, no, you don't understand. This is the Wallace House. And you know, my partner, Dave Jacobs, was never allowed in here on the haberdashery store. In fact, I even think my mother-in-law voted for Dewey against me. And so this is what David Susskind told me. This is the Wallace House, not the Truman House. And he was living in the Wallace House.
And this story is in the Eisenhower chapter, Ike Idolater, that you wrote. And
yeah.
And the reason I mention it, because some of the other stories in here, is that you've got the five, in 1966, you've got the five men that General Eisenhower thought were the five greatest men in the world.
Yes. He said, which you can understand, George Marshall, number one, Churchill, de Gaulle, and then he added Dulles, and then this first Air Marshal Peter Porter. I'd never heard of him.
Air Marshal
was Charles Porter,
Peter,
but called Pete. Peter Porter. He was called Pete, but his name was Charles.
Portal.
Yeah, and he was a RAF General Marshal, and the reason he said this was that again and again, when arguments came up involving Britain and the United States, and Eisenhower chose something that could be interpreted as pro-United States, McCardle always would take the position that he talked Eisenhower into it, and he sacrificed his own reputation for the greater cause, and that's why he put him in there.
Where's this quote come from? I got where I did by knowing how to hide my ego and hide my intelligence. I knew the actual quote, but why should I embarrass him?
Well, this was in 1967, and a man came up, I think it was General Howard Johnson, I could have been wrong, from Freedom's Foundation, or maybe it was Valley Forge Military Academy that he was head of, retired general, and he was talking about Vietnam, and he said, you know, General, because he always called Eisenhower General, not President, even after he left office. He said, Herodotus said about the Peloponnesian War.
General Johnson saying this.
Yeah. Herodotus said, yeah, you cannot be an armchair general 28 miles from the front. And I said, well, that's interesting, Herodotus. The Peloponnesian War. So afterwards, I asked, I said, you know, because I really got into this whole thing by my collection of quotations. Nixon once called me the quotes master general, not because I wrote great quotes, but because I had this arsenal of quotations. And so I said, where did that come from? And I said, first of all, it wasn't Herodotus, it was Aemilius Paulus. Secondly, it wasn't the Peloponnesian War, it was the Punic Wars with Carthage, and third, he misquoted.
General Eisenhower saying
Yes.
this.
So I said, well, why'd you say that? Well, why'd you? You don't understand. I got where I did by knowing when to hide my ego and hide my intelligence. And Eisenhower was a pretty shrewd, bright person. When you were with him, he was this very, in a working situation, he was tough. But then you would see him go out with the public, and it was as if he pressed this button here, and out would come Huck Finn as painted by Norman Rockwell. I mean, he had a face that was so glowing, it would light up a dark room, and he had that ability to then relate personally to the audience. And they always talk about his not getting along with Nixon. Actually, he great respect of Nixon for his foreign policy, and he said that the worst day he ever had, except when his son died, Dwight Dowd, was when Nixon was defeated. But he felt that Nixon had the stuff to be president, but he questioned whether he had the stuff to get elected.
Speaking of quotes, and we find this so often, it's has us going around the country following his footsteps 166 years later. You also quote Tocqueville,
yes,
as almost every book we have here does. Tocqueville once wrote, you say, that every political issue in America is a constitutional issue.
Yes.
Why is he so often quoted?
He was the first to have an insight into the uniqueness of the American democracy. He saw things that the rest of the world didn't see. The importance of the voluntary action, which was just celebrated in Philadelphia. The importance of women in America, that they were stronger and had more influence. The importance of law, that lawyers were the politicians, and this is what he said, every political issue is a constitutional issue, which it is right, and you could say that for a lot of, whether it was the Civil War or even whether we're talking about the Nixon resignation. Every political issue is a constitutional issue.
How many quotes do you have?
Over the years, thousands that I've collected.
How do you keep them?
Under a file such as action, apathy, democracy, youth, under that way. And I don't pick things, I pick things that I say, boy, that is really what I believe, and I wish I had said that. I don't pick things because I think I should have them. I pick something that strikes a chord in me.
Tell a story about Mr. Agnew.
Oh, yeah, wow. Yeah, this was a commencement speech, and this is one of the things I tell people not to do, because you cannot get too precious with your quotations. You can't have quotations that really don't fit the man. I mean, with Ford, I put in maybe Churchill and Lincoln, and Nixon was far better read in history, Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt. But I wrote this speech, and Albert Camus, upon receiving the Nobel Prize,
Spell that, so
C-A-M-U-S, and he said, what makes a job a vocation is the service to truth and the service to freedom. And I thought, well, that was a wonderful thing to use for a commencement. And Agnew gave it, but he said, as Camus said. And afterwards, the reporter came, who's Camus? And I looked and said, early Greek philosopher.
Did the reporter buy
Printed
that?
it. Yeah, he printed KMOS. He didn't print it CAMUS. Yeah, I was taking liberties with the truth there, but there we are.
What's your next book about?
I have a book coming out in November called Richard Nixon's 10 Commandments of Statecraft. I received from Trish and Eddie Cox a card found in his Shallow George Saddle River after he died, which are 10 principles which he said every president should have engraved on their wall. And one principle, for example, is do not destroy by advance publicity the negotiating goal you were trying to achieve. There are never give less to a ally than your adversary is giving to an opponent of that ally. And what I've done is how Nixon applied this, let's say with doing to the friend to Israel in 1972, and then how someone in history did it, in this instance Pericles. So each thing has how Nixon did this with Russia or Nixon did this with China, and afterwards I show how the same principle was done by Benjamin Franklin or Disraeli or other people in history.
Williams College,
Yes.
the Marine Corps.
Well, I didn't. I was turned down. I applied for the Marine Corps and turned down and found out I had high blood pressure, which I still do.
Where'd you go to law school?
George Washington University, which is how I first I got working first for Ken Keating, and then I got part-time in the Nixon White House, and then you know, working while going to the law school part-time, and that's when I did my speech for one speech for Eisenhower.
Main reason you didn't get that ambassadorship to Malta?
Oh, I don't. Well, for one thing, they lost. You know, this was in '92. I don't know. Well, you know, James Baker told a friend of mine, and we had gone to prep school together. He was 4 years ahead of me, and he said something which was very funny and maybe partially true. He said, "Jamie's a legend in his own mind." So he said that to his friend. I don't know. I was told to pick a country which had an English background, like New Zealand or Australia, and I wasn't important enough to get Australia and New Zealand, but I was hoping Malta, and I did go around and get the endorsement of various senators, including Jesse Helms, who was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and who knows?
Here's the book, Confessions of a White House Ghostwriter, 5 Presidents and Other Political Adventures, by James C. Humes. We thank you very much
Thank you
for joining us.